Have you ever received a gift that you didn't know what to do with it? Like someone gave you something and you're like, gee, thanks. What is it? And you sit back on that gift and you're just like, I don't even know. Like I remember when I graduated high school, you get like sent out graduation cards and kids are like asking for all their friends' money at this point, I did the same thing when I graduated high school, and someone gave me an umbrella. I don't even like to wear a coat outside when it rains, a jacket. I don't know, I'm just go enjoy the rain, let it touch your skin, But I got an umbrella. What am I supposed to do with an umbrella? And it wasn't just like an umbrella, like one of those cool umbrellas, like what Burgess Meredith's Penguin used to carry, It was like an umbrella that had like flowers or polka dots on it. I'm not really, although I'm wearing flowers today, I'm not really a polka dot flower umbrella guy. Like, what in the world? What would my coach think walking on campus for the first time? I play defensive end. You're supposed to smash people. You don't carry polka dot flower umbrellas. You yell at the rain and it goes away. Like, what do I do with this? Or have you ever heard stories of like professional athletes who come from nothing financially and that they make millions of dollars and then 4 years later they're broke after retiring? Or maybe you've heard stories of lottery winners who just with the reading of a certain set of numbers, their life changes. And all of a sudden, the house is paid for, the dream car is purchased, vacations are had, and then there's nothing. And a lot of times, those things end up in crazy things like broken marriages and broken families because everybody's fighting over the money. You ever think about like being given a gift and you don't know what to do with it? Or maybe you have a gift that is worth a lifetime of impact, generationally changing, and you squander it. That's the weight of where we are today in the world in which we live, especially the world in which we really live in the United States. As we enter into the summer season, do you know that the United States, among all countries in the world, is the least vacationed country? Americans take less time off from everything they do than any other country in the world. We love to work. We think. Or maybe we don't know how to let go. And there's this tension that begins to happen in the way our lives unfold. We really don't know how to chill. And so if we're going to go into the summer season, don't you think it's appropriate that we discover what it means to chill without squandering what it lays down to? I happen to think that God has so custom made a gift for all of us that we have lived in such a way that we don't even know how to receive that gift. And by not receiving that gift, we actually miss out on experiencing God's fullness. If I told you that you were purposefully, intentionally choosing against God's fullness, would you argue with it? And you could get everything right. You could be the most righteous, moral person on the planet. And if you didn't do this one thing, I think you're still missing out on what God has for you. Never struggle with any sin and still miss out if you don't get this one right, and it's rest. The dynamic of chill, where it begins in the the different languages, learning to rest. Rest is a piece of this, but we talk about this idea of Sabbath. In the Hebrew, the word is Shabbat. There's another word for rest that's nuach, and it means to dwell. And we find them both in Genesis chapter 2 quite purposefully there. In Genesis chapter 2, the scripture reads, so the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the seventh day, God completed his work that he had done, and he rested from everything he had done. And he blessed the seventh day, declared it holy, for on it he rested from the work of his creation. That word holy means set apart. It's like no other day. So God sets this day apart like no other day. And then it says, these are the records of the heavens and the earth concerning their creation. And at that time that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, there were no shrubs of the field, nothing had grown, no plant had grown, for there was no rain yet. And there was no man to work the ground, but mist would come from the earth and water the ground. And the Lord God formed the man out of the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils. And the man became a living being. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he placed the man he had formed. The Lord God caused the ground to grow, every tree pleasing in appearance and good for food, including the tree of life in the middle of the garden, as well as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And we start to watch this unfold as it goes. The place where God looks at everything that was completed and says it's finished, and he rested. In the same space, he creates a garden, a unique space, where the man and soon to be the woman would dwell together, fully provided for, and God would dwell with them. Shabbat and Nuach, they come together. Shabbat is that kind of thing where you take your hands off of something. You can't do anything more to it. Like, I love the Food Network show Chopped, and those people are working like crazy, and then the judges yell, okay, chefs, 1 minute, and now they're going nuts. You need to get something on the plate, and they're going nuts, and then they go, time, and everybody throws their arms up in the air. You can't touch anything else. Time, it's up. All the work that you're putting together, whatever's on the plate, it's done. Done. And then they all smile. Except for that one chef who knows they're getting voted off. They're just like, oh. They know because, like, the fish is still uncooked and they're not serving sushi, you know? So, but you've got those people, they're like, done. Hands are up. It's finished. Walk away from it. Nothing more can be done. That's what we talk about when it says that God rested. He didn't take his hands off as if to leave it uncared for. There was nothing more to be done. It was finished. And it wasn't that God went lazy or that God had to go sleep. Like, I remember when I first became a believer in Jesus, and you would go in, I didn't know much about anything Christian-wise except that God loved me. And we went to church with this one time, and they sang this song, he doesn't sleep nor does he slumber. I'm like, well, duh. If you don't sleep, you don't slumber. And who even writes these words? And then you find it right in the Bible itself, and you're like, oh, never mind. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't need to rest. Like that's a direct correlation to ancient gods who would sleep, who had to be stirred and moved. Lazy deities that other people worshipped. Gods like Baal and Asherah. And you see the tension of them all throughout the Old Testament. But our God, the God of the Bible, Yahweh, he doesn't have to sleep. He doesn't slumber, but he rests. Because everything was complete. He took his hands off of it. It's done. He knows he's got the $10,000 chop check coming to him. It's finished. And when it was finished, there is a place established to dwell. When we lived in California, we had an amazing patio. Like, we ate most of our meals outside just because we could all year long, just because we could. Patio was covered. We lived in a parsonage. That means the church owned our house. So we backed up to a parking lot so there were no houses, no apartments to block that ocean breeze that would blow up throughout the inland. So we had a cool breeze every night. We had flowers on the back patio. I had a barbecue-style kitchen. I had a smoker, a pit grill, a regular grill, a gas grill, or this cooking thing, and, tables. Just because you never know how you're going to cook food, right? It's just like, And we would just cook outside. And then we would sit and we would eat. And we would hang out. We had a fire pit, and it was just a spot, We'd invite friends over to hang out. Well, then we moved to Minnesota. And we don't have a space. The house that we bought doesn't have a deck. It doesn't have a patio. It doesn't have a space. We don't have a fence. I heard that's a Minnesota thing, but I'm thinking next year I'm going to have a fence. I don't know. We'll see. If it's a real Minnesota thing, then I should probably go without a fence, but someone tell me if I'm wrong on that. Because I want to be a real Minnesotan, Yeah, a fence. And so we're sitting there, and there's no place to hang out. And something that we would do every day, just hang out together. Now everything was indoors, and that was new to us. And it was hard to find places to just be together. Now we have like a little sitting spot and a fire pit and those kinds of things. We can hang out. We can dwell. We can pause. And it's that place, like they both work together. Shabbat and Nuach, they're the places where dwell happens. The reason why there were so many codes about honoring the Sabbath and not doing work is it forced people to be together. You just couldn't go do an extra project. Most of the time, if you're like me, your day off is spent working at home. You have a yard, you got a car, you got something to do, right? And so you take time off, and then what do you do with your time off? You work. When do you ever take time to rest and dwell? Like, there are moments when you look at what God did. He said this was good, and he made the day separate. He set it aside, and there are days that we will look at God and we will wonder, was he really finished with creation? There's all these problems, there's all these things. I mean, like, was the platypus just an afterthought? Like, maybe he just needed to take a break, and so he just kind of wrapped up everything in the platypus. Or maybe the platypus is a product of sin. I happen to think that it's not. That the platypus was perfectly created just as it is, but we will tell God all the time how maybe something's wrong with what he intends. And Sabbath is one of those things. We will come into this idea of rest, and we will ignore this beautiful gift that's there. The way we look into this, right? Human production and consumption, they take place in a world that is ordered and blessed and restrained by the God of all creation. Like, everything we do to work happens in the framework of what God has created and established. And for some reason, we think we're better than God, and we don't have to rest. That we never have to take our hands off of it. But this is where we live into. Rest provides a visible testimony that God is at the center of life. You ever think about, like, your family, your job, volunteer work, whatever it is? You ever think, like, if I stopped working, what would possibly happen to that place? Would it just go to pieces without you? If I took a month off work, would Cornerstone just absolutely fall to pieces? No. Don't tempt me. I used to do that in California. Saved all my vacation, took 1 month off, and just go hang out with the family. Church never fell apart. If you took your hands off of something, is it going to fall apart? See, when we're able to really rest, to take our hands off of something, finished, done, time. It's a testimony of faith. To keep your hands actively involved on that thing all the time, honestly, is an act that's faithless. Because God's the one who holds it. He is the creator, the sustainer, the author, the perfecter of all things. living a life that was God-centered. And the command of Israel was that space of Sabbath was to say, take your hands off of it. God's in control. Jesus tells us so clearly, who among you can add one single day to your life by worrying about it? Because God knows your days and all the hairs on your head and the names of the stars. He knows it all. He holds it all. And so why do we think we have to hold it all? Why do we think that our hands are as great as God's hands, if not greater, because God rested? See, entering into rest is an act of faith. The God-centered life demands that we let go of human designs of satisfaction. God is the one who satisfies. And if we don't enter into this beautiful gift that he's made for us called Sabbath, we actually miss something. Now, the ancient Israelites missed something in Sabbath too. So let's talk about rest in the Old Testament for a minute. We see it here in Genesis, but how does it begin to unfold? We see the whole design of temple worship unfolds in that moment of Sabbath. You know, in the ancient temple, there was a moment, there was a 30-minute pause in the worship. Could you imagine that we would come to church together, we would worship together, we would sing songs, we would sacrifice, we would hear scriptures, and then we would just, for 30 minutes, just stop. And no one would leave. And at the end of that half hour, the worship would resume, but that half hour was intended to represent the place of rest in creation. You actually see it in Revelation also. There's this weird verse in Revelation that says that there was a 30-minute pause in heaven. What? Like with all the action in Revelation, why is there a 30-minute pause? Because even at the consummation of time, God is mirroring everything that has been perfected from the beginning. And they would pause. And so we start to watch how this works. God leads by example as he rests, Shabbat, and then he dwells, Nuach, with his people. He establishes that. And we see that happen both in the Genesis accounts. We see it happen in the deliverance from Israel as God is leading them through Moses out of bondage. We see it happen in the Promised Land where they finally get to rest from where they're going and dwell. It's all the way through that Old Testament narrative. When people ignored dwelling with God, he removed them from the land of promise. And we start to see this unfold. Relational trust has always been at the heart of God's Sabbath invitation, but Israel struggled to receive it. And you start to watch all the laws that would amplify throughout the Old Testament into what we know as the Pharisees. They would add all these laws and all these restrictions to protect the Sabbath, trying to keep you from sinning. So we created all these laws hoping to protect God, but they missed that God wanted to dwell with them. And even in the weight of what they thought was Sabbath practice, they were working. They kept their hands on it. They tried to manipulate it. They tried to control it, and they held on tight. And they missed it. They missed the relationship with God. And that's what we see as the outflow, why the prophets spoke, why the exiles happened, is they continually missed relationship with God. In the New Testament, Sabbath doesn't go away. Jesus would actually declare that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. The clearest example in the New Testament of Sabbath is Jesus himself. Very beginning of John's gospel, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's a very intentional choice of words that takes us back to Genesis 2 in the garden, where God dwelt with Adam and Eve. The Word became flesh and he dwelt with us. Very intentional words. It's finished on the cross of Christ. The work was completed. Hands off, no more striving. The work of redemption was fulfilled. We see this dynamic of life when Jesus reminds us, when he looks at people and he talks about what Sabbath looks like, that the original design was to have unity with God, unity with creation, and unity with each other. Sabbath is an expression where the greatest commandment comes alive. It's about loving God and loving others. We're no longer working hard. The rich ruler who comes to Jesus, who says, I've kept all the commands, missed one. He didn't Sabbath. He kept all the commands that he could work and hold, but he didn't Sabbath. The text says that he's a man of extravagant taste. He never gave his servants rest in preparing him food. They were supposed to have equal rest. He never honored the Sabbath, but he kept all the commands, except for number 4. He missed it. And we miss it still. Jesus says that Sabbath is made for us. In Matthew's gospel, there's a few things that are happening, and there's this beautiful connection between the end of chapter 11 and the beginning of chapter 12 that because we put numbers in the way, we often miss where they connect. Jesus says this in chapter 12. It says, at that time, Jesus passed through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pick and eat some of the heads of grain. Probably corn is what they're picking. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, see, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. You could eat, but you couldn't pick up food. Like, the Sabbath was that kind of place. Like, in my house growing up, Sunday nights, my grandmother did not cook. I don't care what was going on. If it was Sunday night, you weren't getting food cooked for you. She made a big meal Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon. Typically, she was a British lady. We had English roast, Yorkshire pudding, roasted potatoes, and overcooked vegetables. Like, it's part of growing up in World War II. You boil the flavor out of everything, right? And so we had that. You know, the roast was great, Yorkshire pudding was great, which is really Brit, but they call it pudding. I don't get the Brits, but that's where they go. You know, and the potatoes were great, and the vegetables had no flavor. It just was part of it. But every Sunday, that's what we had. Sunday night, you were on your own. Grandma's hands were off the kitchen. Her feet were up. She was watching probably something with, you know, Angela Lansbury or something, you know. But she was there. And her space was done. She was locked down for the day after lunch was over. And you'd have to go kind of figure it out. Well, on the Sabbath, you were supposed to prepare enough food the day before so that you didn't have to cook on the Sabbath because cooking is work, right? And so to prepare food for yourself on the Sabbath, that's where these guys are in violation. They're breaking the code according to the Pharisees. Right? And so they're sitting there going. And so Jesus says to them, haven't you read that when David there himself, when he was hungry, how he entered the house of God and he ate the bread of presence, which isn't lawful for him or for those with him to eat, but only for the priest? Or haven't you read in the law that on Sabbath days the priests in the temples violate the Sabbath and are innocent? I'm telling you, something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what this means, that I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not condemn these innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And he declares that he's Lord of the Sabbath. And they start to ask him about what happens in this dynamic and what about healing someone on the Sabbath. And Jesus heals right in front of them. And they're, oh no, Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath. Because you can't care for people on the Sabbath. And then Jesus makes these profound statements. He says, Sabbath is made for the man, not the man for the Sabbath. Like when God established Sabbath, rest and dwelling, it was a gift, custom designed for you. Custom designed. One time in my life, someone took me and bought for me a tailored, custom-fit, measured, sewn suit. I had preached one time at my church in Memphis, like I just started there, and I preached, and this guy, he was like, man, God's got a gift for you. I want to support that. You're going to need a wedding and funeral suit, so I want you to go meet my tailor. And this wasn't the kind of thing where you grabbed it off the rack like at JCPenney's. That's normally how I get my suits. Like this guy took me to the tailor, and there were 3 sets of fabric that were set out. He says, you just choose the one you like, but I like the stripe. Go with what you want. So when the guy who's paying for it says he likes the navy stripe, you go with the navy stripe, right? And they measured you out, custom fit the shirt, custom fit the pants, custom fit the suit. That suit was made to fit one body at one particular weight, at one particular moment in time. It felt so good. I don't think I've ever owned I don't think anything to this day outside of my home itself costs more than that suit. I was like, good Lord. But it fit perfect. Most of my life, I have found clothes that can fit certain areas of my body at a time. There's a reason why I flip up my shirts. Most of the time, my shirts only come to here if you buy them off the rack. I need them to come to here. That custom fit suit, man, everything was perfect. That's the Sabbath. It was custom made for you. Custom made for you to experience God. And what happens so often with that is we completely ignore the gift. We don't know how to rest. Sabbath is about rest. Sabbath is about resistance. Next week we'll talk about resistance. Sabbath is about recreating and enjoying the world around us. We think we know how to do that. We'll get into that. It's about re-engaging others. All the things that we watch the world around us missing right now, with all of its turmoil and frustration, at the core of it is a missing of a gift that God has given to experience Him to the full. So how do we lean into rest? Jesus says, "Come to me, everyone who is weary, and I will give you rest for your soul. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." There is no doubt what Jesus is saying there goes against the grain, pun intended, with the very next chapter of what we just read about the disciples being criticized for picking grain on the Sabbath day or healing on the Sabbath day. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. He's given us this place to experience Him, to dwell with Him, to be with Him, to let go of all the things in life, so that when we, as followers of Jesus, observe Sabbath, we live into a place of restoration that has already taken place. We don't have to fight the world. We don't have to control the world. We have to be with Jesus. We have to be with God. We have to be with the Spirit. That is where that happens, and that restoration has already taken place. When we take a break from the broken rhythms of the hustle, does that sound good to you? To take a break from the broken rhythms of the hustle? To let go of the hardship and set aside time to honor Jesus in our lives, to enjoy His presence, to extend rest to the world around us? That's what happens. When we let go of those things, we experience that relationship more. I hear people say these things like, I want to grow deeper with God. I want to do this with God. I want to do that for God. When God is simply saying, be with me. If you want that transformation, if you want that impact, if you want that depth, stop fighting, stop working, be with me. We'll tell God all the things we want to do for Him all day long, and we will never take time to just be in His presence. And without that, nothing changes. We live life just like Israel, who strove and made all these laws and rules and never changed. Because they stopped being with God. They stopped enjoying His presence. They stopped living under His rule that He was in control. They stopped extending grace to the world. When we trust God's invitation to come to Him and rest, we will enter into places where His presence can truly dwell. I mean, even in the way, like I got this advertisement this week. You ever get like social media advertisements? Man, they know, like the algorithm knows, you know? I got this advertisement this week. The most important 30 minutes you can spend is with this journal. It will direct you to God each day. I'm like, 30 minutes? does that give me space to dwell? Does that give me space to be in his presence? Like we live a lot like the Pharisees. Man, we have this checkbox spirituality that says if I do this for God and this for God and this for God and this for God, then we're good. And if I've really taken time to just be with him, am I dwelling? Can I find that space in my life to be with him? And I don't know that space has a time limit. I think that space has an intention, but maybe not a time limit. Rest is not a commandment that we're bound to. It's a promise that we're invited to enjoy. When we start to look at the commandments and God says to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy, the things that go around that commandment are full of promise. And we start to look at the weight of things, and this is true for most of what God tells us, that we think there's the weightiness to the command, but we miss the invitation of enjoyment. To have the greatest life we possibly can imagine, honoring God's word, comes into that. Sabbath is part of that. And we are invited to enjoy exactly that space. Rest. When we think through this, rest is an act of regular and intentional trust on God's rule on earth. And I don't mean lazy occupation of your mind and your body. I mean rest. And I don't mean sleep. I mean rest. Sleep is a part of that. But there's other ways that we can dishonor the Sabbath and never engage in dwelling with God and others. Rest is an act of regular and intentional trust. So, how do you make time to chill? I want to give some opportunities and invitations to rest this week. A few things that you could do, right? Here we go. Jesus says to them, the Sabbath was made for the man, not man for the Sabbath. We talked about this earlier. He throws this out to them, not to shock anybody, not to detour anybody, but to invite people. The Sabbath is a gift that's made for you. How do you do it? One, suggestion. Take the week and sleep for 8 hours a night. At least 6. Try to get to 8. Just get to 8 a week. 8 hours of sleep. Statistically, you look at everything. You start to watch teenagers in this world today, the way that their schedules drive them. A teenager in their bodies is functioning much like a 2- and 3-year-old and the amount of changes that are happening in that kid's body, that young person's body. There's a reason we call them the terrible 2s and the terrible 3s, right? There's so much happening. That kid, they can't control. Same thing happens for a teenager. You know what happens? Every stage of your life when you begin to hormonally change, similar. There's a reason why you behave the way you do. Your bodies are betraying you all the time. And you will take your 2-year-old and go, okay, buddy, nap time. But your teenager, you tell, stay up as long as you need to. Make sure you finish that paper. Keep working, keep working, keep working. And then we get ourselves in that pattern. 6 to 8 hours of sleep is what's required for humans to rest. If you can get 6, get 6. If you can get 8, get 8. If you're over 65, get 9, 10, 11. I don't care. Take it twice a day. I don't care. 8 hours of sleep. Try to get there. Power off your phone, tablet, laptop, TV. He's fired. By 7 p.m. each day for 1 week. Power them all down. Power them all down. Your brain. If you're the kind of person who looks at your phone or watches TV up to the minute that you go to bed, your brain doesn't let go of those thoughts for hours later. And you're actually not, you think you're going to bed, but you're actually not resting. What happens in your brain, the unseen world of your body, what happens there when you're watching TV up to the minute that you go to bed? I just got to decompress, honey. You're actually pressing. You're not decompressing. Because when you sleep, it's actually taking away rest because of all this, the input and the stimulus that's been going into your head. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, turn the devices off. All of them. Just be. Go hang out outside. Sit on the porch. Get some fresh air. Don't drink coffee. Right? Turn the devices off. Just for a week. Give it a shot. Let your soul rest. Maybe this one is more. Do a 10-minute silent and solitude pause each day. Don't say anything. Don't listen to anything. Don't talk to anyone. Be in a space where you can just break it down. 10 minutes every day. I do this before I go into the house. If I pull into the driveway, straight from coming home from work, I've got all the other things that are swirling in my head, especially if I get a phone call on the way home. So I will pause, there's like a little spot, like just before my house, we'll park there for 10 minutes. Because I know the moment I hit the driveway, I have to be on. I got 2 little girls who are waiting for dad to engage them. I got a wife who I haven't seen all day who wants me to engage her. I have teenage and adult girls who are like, they need dad present. And if I've got everything else going on, I can't be present. And so I will actually park before I get to my house, take 10 minutes, and then go to my driveway and enter that space. Now, you may be different from me in that. You may have other things you got to do. But take a 10-minute pause, silence and solitude, nothing. Don't listen to nothing, don't read anything, don't watch anything. Just pause. Breathe. Clear your mind. And find rest. Jesus isn't just talking about rest for our bodies, but rest for our souls, where the weariness of the world can have no control over you. And if you're like most people in the world, you feel that weariness has been in control for a good minute now. Sabbath allows you to take back control by letting go. It's not being forgetful. It's not being lazy. It's an intentional act of trusting God and resting in Him. It's there. And Jesus is that ultimate rest. As we pursue life with Him, as we come to know Him, Jesus is that ultimate rest where relationship with Him truly allows us to find that space of letting go. Trust Him.